Hello and welcome to this week's set of videos. This is Module 4A, and in this first section we're going to take a look at utilitarianism. This is an idea that we have discussed already in the first 3 weeks in virtually all of the modules that we have looked at so far, and certainly versions of it. But here we want to kind of focus in and unpack this idea, this notion of utilitarianism as one of two major ethical positions, the other being deontology, that we'll look at next week. So in this particular set of slides, I want to look at the following questions, or at least try to answer them. What is utilitarianism? Or what is a utilitarian? And the ideas we want to look at in this set of slides, because both module or 4A and B are on utilitarians and their principal ideas. We want to look at Jeremy Bentham and the principle of utility, John Stuart Mill and the principle of greatest happiness, and Mill also on the principle of utility. All three of those principles on utility and especially on general happiness kind of maintain the focus on utilitarianism. So what is it and where does it start? Okay, it starts roughly in the 1700s. The book that is assigned for this course talks about Jeremy Bentham for the most part. The Benthamites, as they were called, these were sort of early utilitarians. And Jeremy Bentham, a British philosopher, talked about a whole range of issues that we would now call today social issues. He talked about prison reform, for example, and he talked about restricting the use of children as labor. So these were clearly beneficial ideas. Prison reform, child labor law reform. The key word here, reform, right? Reforming society and changing society and making it more in tune or in harmony with human needs. And that kind of, sort of in a general sense, is what utilitarianism is about. So for Bentham, natural law was kind of the foundation, the philosophical foundation of utilitarianism. Now, we'll look at natural law in more detail, but generally right now what it means is the pursuit of happiness. It's a very simple concept. It's different from the law of nature, where we talk about only the strong survive, and the more powerful beast, the beast, and the more power they have over others. It's in fact quite the opposite, because here we don't want the issue of might makes right. We would rather address the issue of, are things equitable for everyone? Is it fair and just for everyone? And this is where this notion of reform comes in. So Bentham is basically using the notion of natural law or the principle of happiness as this prime motivator. And also too, as we will find out when we talk about social contract theory, is the attempt to create a secular foundation to society, not one based on religion and morality based on sort of Christian ideas, but in fact a realistic, non-supernatural conception of human beings. And these would be human beings that would be considered as social individuals, not necessarily religious or Christian. That is secondary. It's not eliminated, but it becomes a secondary characteristic. Social individuals are the primary concern of utilitarians. Now, Bentham is known to have said, nature has placed mankind under governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Now, pain and pleasure, we think of them in terms of bodily sensations, something hurts or something feels good. We need to go further than that. Because when we're talking about pain and pleasure, we're not talking about bodily sensations as much as we are talking about mental sensations and mental states of well-being. So happiness, pleasure, pain, discomfort, these things take on an added meaning. They take on almost a philosophical dimension. Now, normally, human beings, will seek pleasure and avoid pain. We tend to do that. And that's part of natural law. In the pursuit for happiness, we do try to avoid pain. And Bentham believes that this is a very sound idea. It's a very sound way of looking at human behavior. So if that's the case, if human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain, then morality, that value system that informs society, that morality must consist in trying to bring about as much pleasure, again, pleasure in the broadest sense of the word, pleasure as much as possible while striving to minimize pain. That is essentially the motivating factor for Jeremy Bentham and the Benthamites, or utilitarians as they later became known. So the focus is on happiness. The focus is on pleasure and avoidance of pain. And so happiness, and again, each one of these terms, right? Pleasure, pain, happiness, keep them in the broadest and widest sense of the word. It isn't just these bodily feelings. So for Bentham, happiness is viewed as this state of inner sensations, right? Well-being, satisfaction, feeling that one is in harmony with the world around us, that we're at home in the world, right? That's another thought that arose out of this same period, this philosophical period. So the issue here is happiness of individuals, but it must also be in harmony with society, the happiness of society at large. So Bentham is concerned here not so much with human beings. Yes, he is, but he's more concerned with the community in which those human beings live. So society at large, right? That's what matters. Now, this is also an issue that is a criticism against utilitarianism, the notion that society and the community matters first, and then only secondarily the individuals. So if you are a utilitarian, this is something that you will have to reconcile with. But Bentham is concerned about society at large. And so when he talks about individuals, it's not a kind of us versus them mentality, right? This kind of divisive sort of thinking that only certain members of society will enjoy, these benefits that we are going to impart upon society. Only some people will be happy. Only some people will feel a sense of justice. No, he always spoke in this very inclusive language, right? The language of we, us, right? So it wasn't confrontational, it was inclusive. So to think of society at large, which clearly includes everyone, this is the way in which Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarians viewed the world at large, society at large. Now, Marxists may not agree with this, but we have to say, look, if that's the case, if we talk about we and we talk about improving society and social reform, this is the kind of thinking that Karl Marx also picked up, at least when he first began writing political philosophy. This criticism that he had against the bourgeois, right? Their idea of right, that somehow their idea of right, their version of happiness and pleasure was one predicated on the individual, right? There's a very self-centered sense that Marx had about the bourgeois thinking only of themselves. And if that's the case, yes, Marx in the German ideology may have criticized utilitarians, but at least that's where his thinking stems, right? It begins there. This notion of not a confrontational us versus them, but in fact a more inclusive we. And more important is how society will change as a result of thinking of we, benefiting everyone. Now, the textbook does talk about Jeremy Bentham, and also we'll talk about John Stuart Mill, which we will as well. But I also have a soft spot for the French Enlightenment thinkers from the 1700s. I taught a course last year at Western on these folks, so I like to keep them close to my heart. I don't like to see them thrown off into the dustbin of history. So we're going to take a slight detour that I think will help us to contextualize this notion of utilitarianism, certainly the notion of utility. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at France, where something very similar is going on. Because here, the French Enlightenment, radical or otherwise, the French Enlightenment also thought about society rather than individual ethics. Because at this point, their criticisms, right, the critique is based on the massive influence the church had on French society to the detriment of society itself. The French church was essentially saying, listen, get along with your lot in life. When you die, you're going to go to heaven. You'll be super happy. But in the meantime, quit your bitching. And the French Enlightenment said, no, there's got to be a better way. And there has to be a better way for everyone. And what's remarkable is that many of the French Enlightenment thinkers were aristocrats or barons or certainly well-to-do folks. But they were deeply concerned with the poor, deeply concerned with the disenfranchised, the impoverished, the silenced, the marginalized. So a remarkable worldview, a social view that was inclusive. So these French philosophes, as we call them, talked about ethical issues in terms of society at large, not in terms of the individual. So it is in that sense that I want to include their thought, because it does really sort of underpin what Bentham is saying at a later date, but not by much, maybe by 25 years or so. So the French are social reformers, much like Bentham was. All obviously lobbyists that are trying to present this new form of thinking, and at the same time to try to finally knock over and kill off this old order that was based on Christianity. Because certainly in France, more so than anywhere else, the French Catholic Church had a literally stranglehold on society and was not allowing it to develop in any sense other than one that would benefit themselves. And so that was the motivation for the French Enlightenment thinkers to think in terms of utility, but utility for society. So for them, at the heart of this ethical problem, right, was this relationship between moral values, human nature, and culture, and this kind of ongoing tension between these three aspects. So in this particular context, there was an equation made between nature and pleasure, both natural pleasure, like these bodily pleasures that I've just spoken about, and a view of culture as a restraint against certain forms of pleasure. So really, the issue boils down to that. When we talk about happiness and pleasure, we have instinctual pleasures and pleasures that we naturally gravitate towards, and some of them, culture will sort of restrain us from expressing them. So what the French Enlightenment thinkers are trying to do is come up with a society where there will be a minimal amount of restraint, but still a society that is worth living in. There will not be restraint to the point of someone, say, like Plato, who, a couple of thousand years ago was talking about, deny pleasure, deny desires, ignore them. Well, you can't, because, we find out with psychology that you ignore these things and they're going to kind of pop out somewhere else. So the Enlightenment thinkers, even at this early point, are thinking about how to maintain this balance between moral values, our human nature, which is, if it is correct, and natural law is correct in stating that we gravitate towards pleasure, and then the restraints that we now construct by culture and society that will hold us back from certain pleasures. So it's a tall order, to say the least. And these are the kinds of things that were concerning the French Enlightenment thinkers, and certainly the British utilitarians that are coming shortly thereafter. Now, in France, in the early 18th century, this would be the 1700s, the main issue was hedonism, right? And hedonism is simply this notion that pleasure is good and we should indulge in it. Now, you cannot be hedonistic completely and all of the time, because eventually you stop working, you want to sleep in, and society starts to slowly crumble. So again, you have to reconcile some version of hedonism, some sense of enjoying pleasurable activities, but also making sure that society continues to function. So what happens is we start thinking about what really matters, not just from a hedonistic point of view, but from a social point of view. Because hedonism, we talk about the individual. So the shift away from the single person and their pleasurable states to society at large, and what would cause, in a sense, we'll call it social pleasure, or the pleasure of being in that society, because it observes rules that minimize pain and maximize pleasure. Again, we can't go overboard. We can't say, okay, everyone sleep in and eat all day and don't do anything. There has to be some kind of compromise. And this is what this compromise is about. What the utilitarians think about is the actions that are performed. What will be the consequences? If we are purely hedonistic, and we stay home and we make love all day long and eat and have fabulous banquets, very quickly we're going to run out of money, we're going to run out of stuff, and society begins to break down. So the consequences of being hedonistic are ultimately negative, right? Society starts to break down. So instead, we want to think about the positive consequences of different actions, of better actions. So utilitarians start looking at not the action themselves, but the consequences of certain actions. Now, of course, when we talk about actions, they are the actions of individuals. So what happens is when we start to consider the consequences of these actions, we can now pick and choose ones that are going to be beneficial to us and those that will be less so. So the 1700s, which of course is both France and England, the two main countries. There's a little bit of it in Germany, but certainly France and England are the primary countries that during the 18th century, there is this long quest for what constitutes happiness. And the main problem, the main issue in ethics was this relationship between behaving virtuously and some kind of identifier of happiness. What would that actually look like? How would that function? So if that's the case, if now we are less concerned with hedonism, can someone make the argument that, well, you're infringing on my rights, right? I don't want to wear this mask because a mask is not pleasurable. Well, we're talking now about individual rights, right? And that is, as a key word is individual, the rights of the individual person, that social individual. And that's set up over and against the general interest of society at large. So these issues, these questions that we still grapple with, and I just made a reference to wearing masks, and clearly that has to do with the pandemic. These questions don't go away. The examples may be different, but the issues don't go away, because ultimately what it's about is trying to maintain a balance between individual rights to pursue pleasure, because if we believe in natural law, that's what we're talking about, and the general interests of society at large. Now, Helvetius, the picture we see right here, certainly a very influential French radical thinker, but also a French utilitarian. He believed in enlightened self-interest. Now, it's a kind of ethical egoism. Let's not go too far, though, because ethical egoism has got its own issues. But enlightened self-interest was the shift from hedonism, this pure pursuit towards pleasure, towards a kind of more benign and benevolent view of our actions in relation to others, other social individuals, and society at large. So if you have an enlightened self-interest, that means that you are aware and conscious of your level of self-interest, but you also reserve the right to make a choice. I am enlightened enough, I am educated and aware enough that I don't have to be selfish. I can turn around and delay gratification for the sake of society, and I can now address this at a later date, at some other time, or in some other fashion. So Helvetius and other French Enlightenment thinkers did come up with this notion of enlightened self-interest. And this is, again, another stepping stone towards the utilitarianism that we think about today. So what's happening here is once Christian ethics are sort of moved aside, and instead secular thinking, right? Because enlightened self-interest is considered secular. This idea of hedonism, at its worst, becomes a kind of nihilism. So if you see in France, for example, as it moves further and further along, we can have individuals that living at the same time, right? The late 1700s, individuals like the Marquis de Sade, the French writer, he was able to argue that it is right to do wrong. He took logic and turned it on its head and said, okay, are these cautionary tales? Is de Sade giving us a worst case example and saying, the way you're discussing these ideas, you are implying that if you follow enlightened self-interest and you are nihilistic, this is where you're going to end up. That you could conceivably argue that it is right to do wrong because it's pleasurable. So Sade, as whether or not you know who he is making this particular point in his writings. So we have to make sure that we don't shift from hedonism to nihilism, which is a complete denial of all values, all moral values, or of any other kind, and you're simply going for pure pleasure, and society be damned. No, instead you want to move from hedonism to something called enlightened self-interest, knowing that you are going to be able to delay gratification for the sake of society, because this will ultimately be a good thing. So In this point here, when we talk about acting in a utilitarian fashion, we're talking about this principle of utility, right? That's also known as the greatest happiness principle. And how do we define that? Well, there's three aspects to it. The first one is an action is right to the extent that it increases the total happiness of the affected parties. Now notice two things here in that first statement. The total happiness is one, but affected parties, not individuals, but all parties involved. It's a very inclusive way of thinking. So this principle of utility, or greatest happiness principle, is looking at an action and considering it right if it increases, we'll call it social happiness, right? Which of course is derived out of individual happiness. The second one, which is essentially its opposite, an action is wrong to the extent that it decreases the total happiness of the affected parties. So an action is right if it increases happiness, and again in the broadest sense of the word, and wrong if it decreases it. And then finally, happiness itself can have many definitions, right? If something is beneficial, if it's good, if it's useful, right? Utility, if there is some level of utility or pleasure. So happiness is kind of wide-ranging in this case. It's not just, personal well-being. It's the personal well-being of the entire community. Now, John Stuart Mill, another British individual who happens to also be Bentham's godson, also in the 1800s carried on this similar form of thinking. And he also believed that the moral theory of the 18th century, of the 1800s, it's the 19th century, 1800s, because he lived 1806 to 1873. Again, moral theory in this time period, in the 19th century, need to be also based on a utilitarian point of view. Right? It is the only way to have society continue to function at the level that it is and desire to achieve some level of social happiness on behalf of everyone. So how is that done? It's done by looking at actions in terms of their utility, their use, and their use in bringing about the greatest amount of happiness. So again, an action is right if it tends to promote happiness or increase it, and wrong if it produces the opposite, which is pain or a decrease in happiness. So that doesn't mean necessarily that the loss of one is the increase of the other. It simply means that there is more or less happiness. Pain certainly is a derivative of it, but it's always about the greatest happiness. Now notice it isn't, total or absolute happiness. It is the greatest amount. Now what does that mean? It means that some people will be left out of the equation. There will be some individuals that will not feel the same pleasure, for example, that others do, because they may have a religious belief that contradicts this notion of utility. An example I think I used from last week, where in Quebec and Ontario, the primary school and public school curriculum for sex ed now started to include little kids. And so the school was beginning to teach sex ed, age appropriate though, to young boys and girls that were starting school, I think as early as grade 3. And of course, people who had strong moral, upbringings or were religious, as you can imagine, hit the roof, right? They went crazy and said, no, there's no way this is going to happen. And so there was a lot of commotion and protests and demonstrations, and the curriculum was sort of redesigned. Some version of it is still there, but for me, that's a good example of when we talk about the greatest happiness principle, we look at that and say, well, the provincial government felt that imparting knowledge about sexuality to young kids was a beneficial thing to society at large for a range of reasons. So it was not to benefit necessarily individuals. It was meant to benefit society at large. So as more people are educated about matters of sexuality, there will be perhaps less sexual abuse. More kids will be now willing to talk because they realize what is happening is wrong, and they understand that someone touching them inappropriately is a bad thing and they should speak out. Any number of things. But this was the way in which utilitarians would have justified doing something like this, by looking at the greatest happiness principle, which is more education makes more enlightened individuals, which makes better individuals, which ultimately makes a better society. And this is, again, the kind of thinking that started with Bentham in the late 1700s and carries on today. So pleasure, right, freedom from pain, were the only things that were desirable as ends or as means to an end. So this is really not a huge change from what we see from 100 years prior. So Mill certainly carries on the same idea, but now kind of unpacks it a little bit more and starts kind of fine-tuning what we mean by, utilitarianism and happiness. He said, look, if life has no higher aim than pleasure, right, does that not turn us into animals, right? Now, because if we are, then we're getting back into hedonism, we're getting back into sort of pleasure on an individual level. And his answer to this is that if the sources of pleasure are the same for both, right, for both human and animal, then the rule of life for one should be good enough for the rule of the other. And clearly it's not. And he says it isn't, because human beings have faculties that are more elevated than mere animal appetites. And when one is made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. So this is what I've been stating all along. When we talk about happiness, we need to speak of it in the broadest sense possible. That intellectual happiness, aesthetic, feelings of well-being. So happiness is certainly a sense of joy, but it is of a much higher level than simply an animal being happy because, they ate food or had a wonderful bowel movement, whatever it may be. So Mill is clear on this. Animals and humans are different because we have different appetites. We have appetites of a higher level. So if we talk about pleasure, we still need to account for that. So this higher priority, right, that's given to pleasures have to do with the intellect, right? Our level, our degrees of enlightenment. This is what really matters. Because when we speak of pleasure and happiness, we're not talking about sensual pleasures, bodily pleasures. We're talking more about sort of mental and intellectual and aesthetic pleasure as well. Again, this is pleasure and happiness in the widest sense of the word. And certainly we're moving away from the Marquis de Sade here at this point, because very id-like, instinctual, animalistic behavior. This is moving as far away as we can from that. So for Mill, right, some kinds of pleasures are simply more desirable or more valuable than others. And this would be intellectual, aesthetic. To look at a beautiful piece of art or a beautiful sunset. There's a kind of aesthetic pleasure and a sense of happiness that we derive from that because we look at it as something beautiful. Now, we don't know whether animals look at a sunset and go, yeah, it's beautiful. We don't know, right? Because we haven't learned to speak dog or cat. So we need to look at what gives us pleasure at a higher level. And these two types of happiness, this animalistic one versus a human, clearly we need to move towards the human one because it contains much richer and much more varied versions of happiness, right? So as a result, we require a little bit more to make us happy, right? We're not animals. We can certainly suffer like an animal. We can imagine an animal caught in a bear trap or any kind of a trap, and it's an awful thing. But we are also able to elevate our sense of happiness to a greater degree than we can with animals, or at least we think we can. Again, we can't speak their language, so we're just making assumptions at this point. So as human beings, right, we can suffer through imperfections. We're far from perfect. We try to strive and do the best we can, and that's all that can be asked of us. And we try to figure out some better way to achieve whatever it is that we're trying to do. But Mill kind of, reminds us it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And as you can see in each one, the level of happiness, the level of pleasure is of a much higher degree. So these two types of happiness, the animal versus the human, there's a clear distinction between the two. And that's not to say that we can have animalistic pleasures. We can, but we are also capable of having happiness at a much higher level. Now, because modern society, especially in this day and age, just grinds us into dust on a daily basis, and every day we we have another catastrophe to face, economic, political, natural, ecological. Every day it just wears us down. It's kind of hard to always keep these higher pleasures in focus. So those higher capacities kind of get ground down, kind of get dulled down, and these higher aspirations that Mill is talking about, which I'm sure in the 1800s are probably a little bit easier to achieve. It's a lot more difficult these days. We literally have got more and more obstacles in the way to achieve something that resembles, a higher form of pleasure. It takes a lot less work to turn on YouTube and watch something funny than to actually take the time to get dressed, get tickets to go to the museum or the opera or something else. It's just more work. So Mill says, I get it, but let's at least aim high to the best of our abilities. So ultimately, when we talk about utilitarianism, we're still talking about this concept of utility, right? What can we do to make ourselves happy that in turn makes society happy and in an inclusive kind of way? Now, if that's the case and you believe in utilitarianism, that is your prescription, right, for social conduct. Conduct yourself so that all actions, the consequence of those actions, create the greatest amount of happiness. And ultimately, that's what utilitarianism is, right? The greatest happiness principle. The ultimate end is the existence that we should follow through with, try to achieve, aim at, whether or not we get there, but let's keep trying to aim at it, but try to make life as pleasurable as possible with a minimal amount of pain. And again, remember that pain can also be awareness of something else. Even to speak of the number of homeless people or those suffering from drug addictions or any number of things. Just knowing that they are out there should increase our amount of pain because we're suffering just simply knowing about it. So we do something about it. And so we decide to either, help in a soup kitchen, or we donate a portion of our surplus wealth to charity. We do something about it so that our actions will raise our spirits. So we know we're doing something to help. But at the same time, it also elevates society at large. If your money that finally does trickle down to someone who is in need, who is homeless, or has a drug addiction, or whatever it may be, and helps them, then that's how utilitarians think. Your small little sacrifice, right, of $30 a month or whatever it is, will make a difference. So think of charities as really utilitarian in the way in which they think about helping society at large. It's a small price to pay, but the end result is that you have individuals that are going to benefit from your actions, right? And the benefits are pleasurable. They generate happiness for them and for you. So the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness ultimately, but the happiness of all concerned. And again, when we spoke about ethical egoism last week, that if we do something, it outwardly appears to be selfless. Ultimately, we're doing it because we want to feel good about ourselves and we want to be able to sleep at night. We want to sleep with a clear conscience. So if that's the case, we are being somewhat utilitarian because we have done something with a consequence in mind. And the consequence is to increase the amount of overall happiness in society. So utilitarians, right, require that happiness of all be as strictly impartial to the individual as possible, right? We need to be impartial. We need to be disinterested. We need to be benevolent. Again, enlightened self-interest. That's what Helvetius was talking about. So we wish to think about things and say, look, I'm going to give up a very small portion of my surplus wealth, not that I have a lot of it, but I'm going to hand it out, knowing that my gratification will be delayed, but see that at some point, maybe even as early as next year, there will be a change. There will be fewer people suffering. So enlightened self-interest is exactly that, knowing that a small term pain will lead to a long-term gain or long-term happiness. So the pursuit of utility, right, something being useful to society, requires two things: that laws and social arrangements place personal happiness in harmony with those of society. So what happens is if individuals are happy, then society is considered to be happy. I mean, society is not a person, it's an idea. But if there's a sense of general happiness in that society, it is because